deep. That's a deep cover name. You have to be especially geeky to understand how cool that is, and you have to have a sense of humor, and it has to be dark humor. So, if you understand British dark humor and you're very much a geek, then you might find it funny. So, today I want to do a little bit of a weekly news update. And the best way that I can sum that up is by going to some other reporters here that has a news summary of things that are going on in Ukraine. So this is put out by the Kiev Independent. Now, there's been a lot of things that have come up in our news, and as we'll go through this, I'll make some comments, or I'll make some comparisons about how that relates to events for this week, because I think it is quite fascinating.
Against Ukrainian journalists, and there was a pretty big scandal.
Even though we don't know who's behind it, it's pretty clear that it's somebody connected to the presidential office. The phones have been tapped for at least a few months. And all that to discredit the major investigative team. And when you're a president of this country that has this history, it is irresponsible of you to be in a public confrontation with any journalist. Zelensky has to be the champion of free press.
All right, just moving forward, she is not wrong about that. And I wanted to pause it while we've got this logo up because this is just awesome. But she is not wrong about that. His platform to the world, what he has sold to the world, is freedom. And he has an obligation now to carry out those expectations of freedom. And he's doing that by participating with the EU and with NATO and in working with all of these efforts that he's doing diplomatically so that he can fully integrate the country. However, free press is very, very important, and that can change quickly. And this week, the situation changed pretty quickly, unfortunately.
Hello everyone, and welcome to This Week in Ukraine, a show where the newsroom of the Kiev Independent dives into Ukraine's biggest events of the week and explains them in just 30 minutes. I'm your host, Masha Lavrova, and today, for the very first time, the Kiev Independent chief editor, Olga Rudenko, joins us to discuss press freedom in Ukraine, in light of the increasingly alarming attacks on Ukrainian journalists in the last several weeks. Welcome to the show, Olga. We're very happy to have you here.
I'm very excited to be here for the first time.
Before we go on, I would like to remind you guys to subscribe to the Kiev Independent wherever you're listening to this show. Like us, rate us, and write comments. It will take you only a few seconds, but it really does go a long way for us. Thank you for your support. Thanks to you, we're able to ensure that more people stay informed about the news in Ukraine. Okay, let's begin. Olga, the first question that I have for you, is there press freedom in Ukraine? I mean, I'm sure the war hasn't helped with the martial law and with all the other challenges that Ukrainian journalists have faced, but how bad are we doing in that department?
Well, it's a great question and not an easy one. I think with press freedom, there is no such thing as a switch that turns it on and off. It's not like you either have it or don't have it. I think we have it, but it's not perfect. We have it to some extent. And usually people are surprised that there is any press freedom in Ukraine during war, but also because Ukraine in general is not famous to, as a country with high level of press freedom, because we have a history of journalists being killed even before the full-scale war, and attacked, and access to information is limited, and so on and so on. But at the same time, we have a very strong tradition of independent journalism, which is very young in Ukraine also, because there was no independent journalism here until the 90s when Ukraine became independent. Because, as you can guess, during Soviet times, not a big emphasis on the
freedom,
on any freedom, and freedom of journalism too. So, And yeah, in that regard, I think we are doing better than could be expected in these circumstances. But at the same time, there were obviously some developments last week that are pretty alarming in the department. And
So I just want to say here that yes,
it
under the
looks like the
circumstances,
freedom of press
mhm.
is once again under major threat in Ukraine.
I know that last week there were several attacks against Ukraine.
Okay, I have to pause it at this point because I want to point it to her in particular in a moment. But getting back to what Olga was saying, that there has been a history in which the freedom of the press has not been, it's, I mean, it's very difficult during war, for one. And so, I don't know, especially in these circumstances when everything is being done electronically, maybe it's time that we go back to the days where we had war correspondents that would detach to a unit, that were detached to a unit. I don't know. But, and then they come back and they put it all together. So we've had some of that happen in the past, but we could be doing more of that and we need to be getting it out in the open quicker, right? I mean, it's nice to have a documentary and understand after the fact, but there's so much misinformation while big events are actually occurring that I would like to know while it's going on. So, as we discuss that in the US news, I want to bring out that there have been a couple of reports that have really disturbed me this week. And actually, we'll get into some of that here. So, never mind. But here, if we look at this reporter, I'm very fortunate in that this has been done in English. They do discuss that they've been encouraged, or that I think it's Olga that has been confronted about, why are you publishing this out in English? Because we don't want our allies to see this. It makes us look weak. Um, this girl here, I just want to point out how much she looks like Linda Carter. She is Linda Carter. I'm jealous. That is a great, great look. So we're going to go with that. She is now Wonder Woman, and she kind of earns it.
Ukrainian journalists, and there was a pretty big scandal. Could you take us through that, please?
Oh, I want to comment too. She is really a Wonder Woman. The one limitation that she has is that she is not um, born in the West. And it's not her limitation. She is doing incredible journalism, but she almost needs some people from the West participating in a panel that are backing her up and saying, yes, we we agree.
Yeah, sure. So, what happened last week? There were two separate things connected indirectly. On Monday, we learned that a prominent investigative journalist had a threatening visit to his home. So, what happened was there's this guy, his name is Yuri Nikolov, and if you follow Ukraine, you may have not heard that name ever, but you definitely know of his work, because he is the one who broke that story last year. It was the biggest corruption story of the year in Ukraine, with the scandalous overpriced food procurement. One, actually. First, there was food procurement in January for defense ministry, where defense ministry was buying basically a year worth of food supplies for some military units at insanely inflated prices. Some prices were 3 times what you see in supermarkets. And he broke the story, and the contract was stopped, and it saved Ukraine a bunch of money. But at the same time, it was the biggest, like the first big corruption story in Ukraine since the start of the
It did make Ukraine look incredibly weak, very, very weak. And unfortunately, people still refer to that when there are arguments regarding corruption. And this is deeply unfortunate. But this can also be controlled when there is a level of openness and measures are taken by both the press and the government so that the public have an accurate look of what's going on. That includes allies, not just your citizens, but the public in general, because you have allies with a lot of skin in the game right now. So, unfortunately, that's kind of where Ukraine is at. But there needs to be some transparency, and that does not mean that it's always going to turn out negatively. It just means that it's a lot of work to explain what's going on because it's very, very difficult. And as we're going to get to see, boy, we don't have a lot of time to get a narrative out.
Full-scale war, and it was really, kind of ground shaking. And a lot of people kind of hate him for that, as you can imagine. And then months later, he broke a second story about procurement of uniform of jackets for Ukrainian military. Again, at inflated prices through a shady intermediary that didn't have to be there, and so on and so on. And after the second story, the defense minister had to be
replaced.
They fired them in a polite way. They let them resign.
Yeah.
He was.
The thing is that when the USSR was split up, so when Ukraine became their own nation, and Russia did the same thing, and they didn't have any kind of plan for democracy. They didn't have any kind of protections for the people. They didn't have the kind of infrastructure, the kind of law, anything that could really protect people from corruption and just complete thuggery. And that is exactly what happened. And, Ukraine participated in that. There were a lot of people in Ukraine that participated in that. A lot of people they made a lot of money. And so this kind of corruption needs to be called out. It needs to be called out big time. And then the world gets to see how it's dealt with.
Replaced, we can say that. So that cost the minister his job. And what happened was several young men came to his apartment in Kiev, and they started banging on the door, insulting him, demanding that he answers the door, and shouting things like that he should be in the army, that he's dodging the draft, and so on and so on, insulting him and demanding that he joins the military.
He wasn't at home, right?
He wasn't at home, and to make things worse, the only person who was at home, according to him, was his elderly mother, who did not, thank God, answer the door.
That must have been terrifying.
It must have been. And the important detail is that the video of this happening, filmed from outside the door, so filmed by one of these guys, immediately appeared on an anonymous Telegram channel. Mm-hmm. And not just any Telegram channel, but one that, even though we don't know who's behind it, it's pretty clear that it's somebody connected to the presidential office, because this Telegram channel always supports all the talking points of the office and always goes after the enemies of the office, in a very vocal way. And this video just appears there with some insults against this journalist added to the video. And that's it. That's there is a threatening visit and a Telegram channel that is connected to the presidential office apparently immediately posts the video, which makes you think that they were behind it.
Yeah. That actually was my next question. Do we know who's behind these visits or just this attack in general?
That's the thing. We don't know who was behind it, but we might find out, because after this became a major scandal, several days later, the national police actually opened the case, and surprisingly, they were able to identify, at least they say they were able to identify several people who were the perpetrators of this attack. And they did not publish the names, but they published, the blurry images of them being either detained or their homes were searched or something like that. But this is the thing with any attacks against journalists in the whole history of Ukraine, the perpetrators sometimes are found. The people who ordered the attack are usually never found. And if you go back to as far as to the case of Georgy Gangadze, who was a very famous Ukrainian journalist who was murdered in the year 2000, so 23 years ago. And in his case, it took many years for the perpetrators to be arrested and eventually.
To be honest, you can't stop thinking about Linda Carter now, can you?
Imprisoned, but we never got to who actually ordered the killing.
Wow. Well, and that wasn't the only attack against the journalist last week, right?
And exactly, and it's all about how they were stacked together. Because the next day, after Monday last week, we are shocked by this thing that happened to Yuri Nikolov, and then the next day, something even worse comes out. So there is this investigative outlet called Bihus Info. It's a strange name because it's named after the founder, Denis Bihus. And they have been around for at least 10 years, I think. And they were behind some of the biggest investigations in these 10 years. When there was a presidential election in 2019, and it was then President Petro Poroshenko against the newcomer Volodymyr Zelensky, there's a popular speculation that Poroshenko lost the re-election because of a story that came out in Bihus Info a couple months before the election.
Wow, that is big.
That is it. I mean, it's not true that he lost because of that. There was a number of reasons, and his popularity was already low. Mm-hmm. But many saw this as the final kick. So they.
It almost seems to me like that's becoming a way to operate. At least that seemed to be the case since that information dropped about Hillary Clinton, and Trump had pretty much asked them to find information on her, and then it dropped right before the election. It almost becomes just a way of operating now, and I don't know. It seems ridiculous to me that one can't recognize that there are patterns that are happening on a global level. And, the U.S. isn't safe just because it's the U.S. It really isn't. I mean, we ate up 3 days this week of just one story, misinformation. Last week, it was like 4 days. It's ridiculous. We don't have our journalists that are spending time on this kind of stuff. But we'll get into that.
They are a huge deal in Ukraine, and they're pretty popular too. So they're not some small niche outlet, not at all. And so what happened was a video pops up on YouTube, and it is posted by a website. It looks like it's a news website, but when you look closer, it's actually just posing as a news website because there is no real team of journalists.
Yeah, I heard that the pictures were actually AI generated, so that's not even actual people.
Yeah. So it's a website that poses as a news outlet, and it publishes a video on YouTube, and the video is meant to show that the team members of this investigative outlet are using drugs at their private party.
So obviously they can't be trusted because they're drug
users.
The purpose of the whole thing.
The purpose of the whole thing is to show that the investigations can't be trusted because they're
high.
They high while
all the time
doing the investigations. What's actually in the video is quite concerning. So the team did have a New Year, several days before the New Year, they had a New Year party for the team, for which they rented out a few rooms in a hotel near Kiev, and they went the whole team went there and celebrated the end of a very difficult year. So what happened was the team didn't know that there are hidden cameras in the hotel, in the rooms. And the cameras were apparently installed right before they arrived.
Yeah, I read that the administration of that hotel said that all the rooms were rented like a day before.
Yeah, so one day before this party that is planned, a man comes in and one person rents all the rooms in the, books all the rooms in the hotel for one day.
Weird.
Yeah, I know. And then something like 30 men, the hotel said that they were acting kind of weirdly, like they were, having dinner.
If you're counting, that is too official weird.
And whenever a waiter would approach, they would all, stop speaking, and it looked kind of strange. So they all come in for one day, and then they leave. And then the journalists come in and check into these rooms, and they have their celebration, and then they leave. And then the next day, a different man, again, books all of the rooms. And then not 30 men this time, but just a few come in and go through all the rooms. And, apparently what happened was they installed the cameras before the journalists arrived, and then they had to book the rooms for one day again to take them out. And the hotel thought that it was suspicious, but they of course didn't think that they're doing like.
She is nodding like, yes, this happens all the time. Get it? Proceed.
Meddling with cameras and stopping. So let's talk about the video for a second here. The video is not as scandalous as you can imagine it. So in the video, there is you can see footage from inside one of the hotel rooms where you can see a table and a few people from the team, mainly camera people. Yeah, they are using some drugs. What is also very concerning, that same video also had recordings of their phone calls where they're discussing preparations for the party and they're discussing buying these drugs. That means that their phones were tapped. Imagine the effort, 30 people who come in to rent all the rooms in this hotel just to install the cameras, and then they come in after that to take the cameras, they look through the footage, they find that one bit where somebody's using drugs, and they're like, bingo, we're going to use that against them, and they add to that the phone conversations, and all that to discredit the major investigative team that has been active for at least 10 years and that has taken down so many corrupt officials and so on and so on. That's played. It's literally one of the pillars of Ukraine's democracy. This group of people.
An anti-corruption movement.
An anti-corruption movement, exactly. And this group of people is so essential. And somebody went to great lengths to try to discredit them based on the conversations that were in the video. The phones have been tapped for at least a few months.
Wow.
But yeah, it was actually encouraging to see that people were...
Ukrainian societies.
The public was actually enraged by the fact of the surveillance. And I was watching this reaction unroll from like the first few hours onwards. And
wow, I have to just say how super, super scary that is. They have a team of legitimate press that have been investigating corruption in Ukraine, and they're taken down. Bravo, Russia.
From the very beginning, from the moment when there was only like a few dozen comments on this video on YouTube, many comments were like, why do we have this video? Why is there this video? Why does it exist? Who took that? How was that possible? That's not legal. So people were not commenting on illegal drugs as much as they were commenting on surveillance of journalists.
Yeah, and how problematic that is.
Yes, and that was actually, that was a good signal. There was a sign of a healthy society that has their focus in the right place.
What about, that brings me to...
That is an incredibly refreshing sign that the public would be outraged by that, and that they would say, wait, what happened to our free press that has been watching the government to making sure that they are not corrupt and that they're taking care of our people? That's valid, guys. And by taking that out, you're taking out a huge part of democracy right now. I mean, I don't know if I don't want to be an alarmist here, but we also know a pattern of encroaching Russians, and this feels like that. And I just want to put out there that in our own media in the West, this story about Ukraine shooting down their own Ukrainian soldiers in captivity is ridiculous. Think of my job kind of in the realm of what you would say almost law enforcement or something. Anyone can call and they can say whatever they want, right? But it takes more than that for an intervention. Like, for example, if I get a case referred to me and they don't have any evidence whatsoever besides someone saying that it happened, that's silly. Okay, there it would be better evidence if they just said, we are saying that it happened, and not providing any evidence whatsoever than to provide some pictures that show a lack of evidence. It is just ridiculous. And our news sources in the West picked this up as Russia had reported something. While, yes, it is accurate, they did report something, but who cares? Why does that matter? What? How is this relevant, and why are you wasting 3 days on this? It's just aggravating. There are so many important stories that need to be covered by our journalists, but that no one is really paying attention to. And that's too bad. People are relying on media, and they are relying on media to be able to determine when a story is newsworthy. Now, for me personally, I would think a story could be newsworthy when there is at least uh, a preponderance level of evidence where you have to essentially say, I am 51% or more, or 50% or more certain that this happened. Okay. It shouldn't be getting on CNN until something like that happens.
To a natural question, have we had other comments? Have we had comments from the government? Have we had comments from Zelensky and the administration about these two situations?
It was a pretty shocking thing to have these two situations: the
Back-to-back
visit to Nikolov, and then this back-to-back. Exactly, it was Monday and Tuesday, 1 week. And when this happened on Tuesday, everybody was like, "What is going on? Like, what, is this? Are we back to Viktor Yanukovych's times or something like that?" Like, that's how it felt.
Linda Carter.
And it's honestly, it's hard to believe that whoever did that is not trying to sabotage Ukraine, because it is sabotage. It also happened when Zelensky was in Davos.
Yeah.
It also happened when he is talking to our foreign partners and making the case that Ukraine is still a democracy, is ready to enter EU and so on, is a pretty big part of the conversation.
And press freedom is a big part of that.
It's a huge part of that. I know for a fact that EU, for example, is watching press freedom in Ukraine closely, make sure that they are not persecuted in any way. And Nikolov is definitely one of those people, and Bihus-Info definitely among those people. So somebody harmed Ukraine so much by doing that it's either extremely stupid
or really well planning, like for discrediting of Ukraine.
Yes, it's either extremely stupid or they are just working for Russia.
Yeah, these two situations, these attacks against independent journalists are not looking good. And while we had really healthy or seemingly really healthy response from Ukrainian society, have we had any response from Zelensky and the administration?
We did. It didn't come in very fast, but I think it was 2 days after this happened, or a day and a half after this happened. Zelensky, in his daily address, he didn't, I think, mention the journalists by the name or by the name of the media outlet. But he said that any pressure on journalists absolutely unacceptable. And I think he mentioned surveillance. I think he said concerning situations like the surveillance of journalists, it's absolutely unacceptable.
So, I mean, we've gotten a response from Zelensky and the administration, but is that enough as, journalistic?
That's a really good response, by the way. Very good response. And the fact that that was put out by his office when he was in Dallas is just ridiculous. It would seem to suggest more that his account was hacked, or that someone got into close to someone that had access to the account, as opposed to Zelensky actually condoning that, because it really benefits Russia.
Community been satisfied with that?
Well, it's good that there was a response. That was definitely, welcome. At the same time, I think if you're working in journalism in Ukraine, you have a memory of how various top officials, including Zelensky, have treated journalists in the past. So you have a memory of many instances of him snapping at journalists at press conferences, or an attack on journalists being unanswered and provoking no reaction, and so on, so on. And when you have that background memory of this backlog, I think it affects how seriously you can take Zelensky saying that pressure on journalists is unacceptable.
This is a very extremely vital point to understand, that you may not, if you don't understand the culture, or anyway, just to kind of explain the way that it is. There was always the Tsar, there was Stalin, there was Lenin. Everyone always needed a papa. Everyone needs someone to rule over them, to make them a good society, keep people in check, protector of the people, this kind of thing. That's not going to work anymore. Besides, in this case with Ukraine, the women are stepping up just like they did in the US and, well, all of the West, from what I recall from historical accounts. As a side note, I'd like to say that I would like the women to be acknowledged even more. The nation, I mean, this is just completely an opinion statement, and it's not even that. It's a kind of, I wonder statement, Maybe I'll just, maybe I'll wait on that for a minute.
Unfortunately, it is fair to say that it is his behavior that has prepped the ground for attacks on journalists. Because from the very beginning of his tenure in 2019, he has made it clear that he's not welcome criticism. There is a history of Zelensky snapping at journalists at press conferences and getting into arguments with them. At one point, he said something like, commenting on some journalists' behavior, he said his parents didn't do a good job raising him, which is kind of personal and in poor taste, you can argue.
Yeah, it's not professional. They're just doing their job.
Yeah, but whenever I saw this happen, this public confrontation between Zelensky and journalists, I thought this is so irresponsible on his part. Because he needs to remember that he is the president of a country where there is a history of journalists being killed after presidents spoke badly about them. If you go 23 years back, there was President Leonid Kuchma, who apparently hated journalist Georgy Gangadze, who was
She is fantastic and brilliant to bring these points up.
quite critical of him. In a normal way, in an absolutely normal journalistic way, this journalist was confronting him. And Leonid Kuchma, then president, was talking, not knowing that he's been recorded, and saying things like, we need to do something about him. We need to do something about this journalist. Next thing that happens, this journalist gets kidnapped and killed by people working for Interior Ministry at the time. Mm-hmm. It was never proven that it was Leonid Kuchma who ordered the killing. But we can be sure that this journalist was killed because Leonid Kuchma was mad with him. And when you're president of this country that has this history, it is irresponsible of you to be in a public confrontation with any journalist. Zelensky has to be the champion of free press. He has to take on that role publicly. He may hate them in person. He may hate the stories that come out about his allies or corruption or something. But it is his responsibility to publicly support the freedom of press, and publicly support journalists. And
especially now.
And I think he's not always taken that way. He's not even taking it seriously.
Well, this is concerning for many reasons. And as you said, Ukraine is famously not known for it being a safe place for journalists and independent journalists and journalists who are critical of the government. You're in journalism through all of these historical moments in Ukraine. You've been doing journalism during Yanukovych's lead and during the revolution that got him out, during the annexation of Crimea, and all of these things that have affected Ukraine greatly. And that's all before the full-scale invasion. So do you think what's happening now, like these attacks against independent journalism, is a rollback to the times of Yanukovych? Because I feel like that's what I've seen on social media, people suggesting that's like, are we going back to that time?
We mentioned Yanukovych times because that was, in a sense, the darkest time, because we had a pro-Russian president who was corrupt and who was about to take Ukraine into a close union with Russia.
And way away from European Union.
Exactly, and that was why people came to the streets, and something known as Euromaidan Revolution happened. And
okay, that's just a complete oversimplification.
Which was thrown out. And I think there was a very big expectation that when he was kicked out by Euromaidan Revolution, at a great price, by the way, over 100 protesters were killed for that to happen. And
that is not, that's more than correct.
Russia used the moment to start the invasion and annex Crimea. And I think there was a great expectation that because such a high price was paid, that now we are on a good track, and now we're gonna reform, we're gonna end corruption, the media is gonna be always free and untouchable, and we're gonna be a strong democracy, and so on and so on. And
absolutely, guys. When you're fighting for this kind of stuff, you cannot afford to negotiate. You can't. You have to have a free press. You have to insist on the things that are going to create a democratic nation.
Some of that was happening. Indeed, we got anti-corruption institutions, and we were, in many regards, we were on a good track. But every government, every president always had at some point arrived at the moment where they started perceiving journalists as enemies. So, for example, for President Petro Poroshenko, that moment came in 2016 when something known as Panama Papers was released. So Panama Papers was a huge leak of documents from a firm that registers and runs companies in offshore jurisdictions. And it turned out that President Poroshenko in 2014, I think, was at the height of this initial invasion by Russia, was apparently busy trying to move some of his assets offshore. And he said that it was all, just like bureaucracy preparing to sell the assets and so on. They needed to be moved to different jurisdictions, but it kind of looked pretty bad. And I remember vividly that it started.
And the press is giving him way too much attention. Western press.
A wave of online attacks against journalists. Like there was a campaign after campaign after campaign that tried to undermine journalism in general. But I don't think that campaign on the Poroshenko Times really succeeded in undermining journalists. But now we see it kind of
starting again,
and it's just frustrating to see that every regime in Ukraine is trying to make journalists their enemies, and every regime is trying to fight journalists, and the journalists are still there.
And at least this time we can see that the society is actually being quite supportive. So
guys, that is a huge red flag. It doesn't matter what country you are in, but if you do not have free press and you do not have free speech, you're in a lot of trouble. If there were no free press, free speech by individuals, but the press was allowed, to speak freely, then that would sway people's opinion in Russia. But it is not a free press. People are not allowed to say their opinions. It is run by the government. And in this case, I want to make a clear distinction. This is a nation at war. This is the same as in Russia. You could say that, to protect borders, there's always on some level a country has to also maintain security of their country by managing some, not just misinformation, but harmful information. Okay, harmful, bad information. I do not see why that is too much of a problem. Like your feet, like today, not today, but this week with the plane crash, that was terrible. And unfortunately, when you think about the psychological impact that could have on people fighting on the front lines for both nations, but that could have a devastating impact for people that are captured, that are being told that, yeah, your own people blew up other prisoners. It just goes on and on about how many seeds of hatred and evil you can embed into this story. That's why it's just dangerous. It's like making up, if you're 5 years old and you were saying, and what about, and then let's pretend if this happened and then this happened, it doesn't go anywhere. And people aren't using their critical thinking skills. The news is vetting this information. People are just assuming that because it's coming from a big news source that it is credible. It isn't anymore. This is very scary. It's happening here in the US, obviously, because we've had a couple of those stories in just the last couple of weeks. So I'm all for shutting that kind of stuff down. There has to be limits. Not everyone just gets, free speech when that speech is the wrong speech, when it's defamatory, things like that.
So it's already not working as well.
Right now it's a difficult moment for everybody in Ukraine. People are agitated. People are anxious about... Tired, extremely exhausted. And does it make people more vulnerable, more susceptible to potential campaigns that are trying to push this narrative or that narrative? For example, the narrative that journalists can be trusted. We'll have to see.
Ukraine has been incredibly lucky to have strong independent journalists throughout all this time, throughout all of these challenges from the government. But now we also are coming into the third year of full-scale invasion, and there is martial law, and there is also like ethical questions of reporting on different stories. And I mean, obviously emotionally it's been a really challenging time, not only physically threatening, but how has the invasion and full-scale war affected journalism in Ukraine?
So I've been saying, and I know not everybody agrees, but I've been saying that as horrible as the physical threats of the war are, in the long term, if you think about journalism as a field, as a profession in Ukraine, maybe the biggest long-term threat to it is the effects that self-censorship can have on it. And I've been working in journalism for, if you count my first job, maybe 14 years, something like that. And up until the full-scale invasion, I don't remember there ever being the understanding that there are stories that can be touched.
Yeah.
So
she's bringing up a beautiful question here. It's absolutely brilliant because I'm in the United States, and from my perspective, it could be easy to say, hey, you need to be having a free press when it comes to war situation. But America hasn't been in the same situation before. And we would not, I don't think our between law enforcement, whatever operations they were doing, whether it's they have a lot of operations they're doing, sheriff's office, state government, there's a lot of people that are monitoring the situation all the time. So it's tough to communicate with everybody, and the press isn't really welcome in those areas, but they do have those press officers, and those are the people that are really critical in fighting misinformation. Just when John Kirby still does a fabulous job at fielding some of that.
I just see my colleagues, not at the Kiev Independent, but at other publications, sometimes struggle with what they can write about if they know that this is happening and it deserves coverage, but at the same time the story can make, to simplify it, make Ukraine look bad. For example, I think there hasn't been enough coverage of the issues connected with mobilization in Ukraine. Mobilization is a very, this is the topic in Ukraine now. This is something that people talk about in their kitchens all the time.
And it's a very challenging topic because there's
And
no
it's a
right
very
answer.
challenging one. Well,
Or at least it doesn't seem like there is.
It's not up to us to find the right answer, but we need to, if it is something that people talk about all the time, we need to cover that. And we did a story about it, but I think there is, yes, by Francis, it came out a couple of days ago. It's a good story, read it. But I think in general in Ukrainian media there is very little coverage of mobilization on the level of people who are afraid, people who are trying to evade it, people who are trying to flee Ukraine. On that, like this is a huge thing that is happening.
I mean, it would make sense that Ukrainians don't want to disrupt that image of these brave Ukrainian people who are going to die for their country, who are willing to lay their lives for the freedom.
But the truth is much more nuanced and three-dimensional. It's not this. The people who are defending Ukraine in the trenches, who are fighting now, they're not all. Their story is not a story of a fearless soldier who is happy to die for his motherland. It's a story of somebody who is making a difficult choice, who has fears, who has family at home, who is afraid that he's not going to see his daughter ever again, and he's still making the choice to be there and fight.
I think this is really a critical point that she is bringing up. This needs to be brought to the attention of the press. When the full-scale invasion first happened, you still had a lot of people that were going into the war, and they were doing it voluntarily at that level still. And that is not exactly the case anymore. And when people are facing these types of scenarios where they could be mobilized, they need some people they can relate to. And it's a good thing to talk about. There's a lot of struggles there, and it's just a worthy conversation to have.
fight, and he's nuanced. It's difficult. It's not all
Black and white.
heroic and black and white, and but that makes it stronger. That actually makes the story stronger. The story of
Byron,
Ukraine stronger. It's not two-dimensional. It's not like that. But to cover all that means to touch upon the things like, some people don't want to fight, some people don't want to die, some people are scared, and they have the right to be scared. It's part of the story. It's all part of the story. And then there is a whole issue of the draft officers sometimes behaving in a crazy way and like grabbing people off the street. That's happening, and there are videos of that happening. But we've also seen that happen in Russia a year ago, and there is so much concern of like, we don't want to look at Russia. We don't want to show that something that happened there, and we all like made fun of that and so on. Something like that is sometimes happening in Ukraine now, and that's when self-censorship kicks in for journalists. Like maybe I want to do a different story today. Maybe today I'm gonna work on something about like this and that, but not about this.
I mean, it's scary to receive negative feedback from the readers. I mean, I've recently, we've made a video for TikTok about the protest for the money for Ukrainian armed forces. Somebody actually wrote down, a Ukrainian wrote down in the comments saying, "Why are you releasing this in English? This makes us look really bad. This tells people about corruption in Ukraine." And I'm like, but that's why we need to be talking about it. This way, people are fighting the corruption. From the beginning of full-scale invasion, we had a lot less, corruption scandals and stories, and because everybody was focused on the invasion, on the war, and learning how to report on that and just to live in that environment. And now that people and journalists,
it is absolutely critical for a free nation to be calling out corruption like this. Absolutely critical. And unfortunately, we in the United States, we're having a real issue with this now. But if the precedent is set at the very beginning when these rules are being defined, when they are being looked at right now, that's going to be really hard to walk back.
got more used to this horrible reality. Now there's more stories coming out with corruption and things. So do you think it's okay to be reporting on corruption, to be reporting on those uncomfortable stories and showing Ukraine not in an idealized way during the war, even though it might not look great from outside perspective?
I think it's not just okay, it's the only right thing to do. Just to set the timeline right. So when the full-scale invasion started in February 2022, I think it's fair to say for the first 6 months or so, Ukrainian journalism was in a state where we were not really performing our, watchdog function as, like what we used to, because we were focused on the invasion, the Russians, the war crimes they're conducting, and so on and so on. It was all, there was a feeling that we are in this moment where we're not certain that we're gonna survive. And then when a few months passed, and I think it is, I would say that September 2022 is when things were back to normal, in the sense of stories started to come out about corruption and about some misconduct and misdeeds of Ukrainian officials and so on and so on. We at the Kiev Independent were, I think, the first to publish a story about misconduct in Ukrainian military. In August 2022, we did a story about International Legion that pointed out some misconduct in the...
How was that received?
It was received very...
If it is not pointed out, then you end up with situations like we have with Donald Trump. You just have to call out corruption.
well by the public, but publishing it at the time was a big decision for us because, we didn't know if we would be persecuted or labeled traitors or so on. So we didn't know what kind of response we would get, and it was a major decision to do, but to make. But I think it was very important because it's kind of, the way I perceive it, it crystallized the values of the Kiev Independent.
As you said, everybody's been affected by the invasion. Everybody's been affected by, freedom of press or the lack thereof of Ukraine historically. Has KI been affected in the existence of Kiev Independent?
So I think we do suffer from the same limitations as other Ukrainian media outlets. For example, getting access to the front line to cover it is very challenging. And whenever you see a story in the Kiev Independent that is from the front line, that is coming from a journalist who was embedded with a unit, you know that behind that there is days and days and days of negotiations and work and many phone calls and text messages to try to negotiate this access. And then you come and you risk your life in a major way to be there for at least a few hours with those people. But it's difficult to even get there. I think when people read the stories, when they think that, the journalist is so brave to be there, and that's what they mainly focus on. But the journalist, if you ask them, they would probably say that the most challenging part of the work was to get there. Because unfortunately the government has been trying consistently to limit access to the front line. It's very hard, but I think we are doing a very good job staying immune to self-censorship. I think in that regard we are very successful. I think we have experienced some undue attention from some Ukrainian law enforcement agencies who seem to be very eager to make it clear to us that they are watching what we do and not extremely happy with our coverage.
And that they're not too far.
And that they are powerful. Well, when you think about it, if you're a journalist in any country, but I think especially in Ukraine, you are always outpowered, if that's the word. The balance of power is so not in our favor. We are doing something that is very annoying to the people who are much more powerful than we are. It's true for any country, but it's especially true in Ukraine during martial law. And it's something that is always hanging above our heads. And we are continuing to do what we do because we believe that the story of Ukraine needs to be told without sugarcoating. We think that we sincerely believe that we're doing Ukraine a great favor by that we are helping the country that we love by telling the truth about it.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the question from our community. Olga, the question that our community has for you: how will you ensure that you do not unwillingly harm the war effort with information that could benefit Putin's war?
Oh, it's a great question. We indeed need to, especially when we report from the front lines, we need to make sure we don't accidentally disclose something that shouldn't be disclosed. For example, a location, or sometimes soldiers would talk about the future plans or strategy for a certain thing, and we cut that out. When we are posting imagery, we need to make sure that the metadata on the images is wiped out. There is nothing that can disclose the coordinates. And there are things like that. There are things like when Kiev is hit by missiles or drones, so there are limitations on what we can show and when we can report it, that are meant to, limit how fast Russians can learn about the effects of their attack.
And course correct.
Yes, and correct, yes. And we are carefully sticking to that, because when it comes to real defense-related issues, like the positions of the military, missile attacks and things like that, there you accept certain limitations.
Olga, thank you so much for being with us. This was really important topic that we've discussed here, and I'm really grateful that you had time to join us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.
You can find the show on YouTube and all audio platforms every Friday. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to like, comment, and leave reviews wherever you're listening to it. Also, follow the Kiev Independent so you never miss a new episode. Consider supporting us by becoming a member of our community. It is pretty easy to do. You can do that at kievindependent.com/membership.
that's really all I wanted to go over today. That's about an hour, and I want to be respectful of people's time and try to keep it at that level. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you join the channel and like the video. Thank you.